the name of the Father and of the Son and of Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. Chosen one, they mistook you for ordinary. They passed by you, glanced at your presence like background noise, forgettable, replaceable. But now look at what remains in your absence, a silence so deep it roars. They thought you could be ignored, yet without you the atmosphere itself has changed. They didn't just lose someone, they lost a divine current, a covering they never even knew was there. Have you ever poured out your heart, your time, your compassion, your late night prayers, only to feel invisible, like your love was assumed, like your loyalty was owed? But the truth is this: you were never just present. You were placed not by chance, not by accident, but by the hand of the Most High. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. Jeremiah 1:5. You were an assignment from heaven, a vessel wrapped in humility, carrying spiritual authority that no one recognized until it was gone. And now they stumble, they fumble in a darkness they once mistook for light. Because when you walked away, heaven's light walked with you. And the peace they took for granted, that peace was never theirs. It came through you, through your quiet obedience, through your unseen warfare, through your whispered prayers that built fortresses around their chaos. The world honors the loud, the platform, the praised. But when God wants to shift the atmosphere, He does not send a celebrity, He sends a servant. And that servant was you. Let them sit in the silence now. Let them feel the absence of what they never had the eyes to cherish. The spiritual drought that surrounds them. That's what happens when divine alignment is ignored. When they rejected you, they didn't just reject a person. They rejected an anointed connection. But do not grieve, chosen one. This was never your loss. This was heaven's redirection. You were not discarded, you were relocated. Not by man's hand, but by the will of the Almighty. For He saw what you could not, and He shielded you from what they were never worthy to receive. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. And every tongue that rises against you in judgment you shall condemn. Isaiah 54:17. You didn't fail, you fulfilled the assignment. And now the withdrawal of your spirit is their lesson. Not every blessing can be replaced. Not every covering can be duplicated. Now as you step forward into this divine role, I invite you to declare your readiness. Type 777 in the comments below as a sign of your acceptance. As a bold statement that you are ready to step into your God-given purpose. And stay with this message until the very end, because we'll close with a powerful prayer for today. One that will seal what heaven has already begun. Your journey is seen, your tears are recorded, and you do not walk alone. In the next few moments, you'll receive a divine revelation. One that speaks directly to the pain of being overlooked, the weight of unrecognized purpose, and the shift that happens when heaven reclaims its vessel. This is not just reflection. It is a holy confirmation that your absence was not rejection, but redirection. You didn't walk into their lives with fanfare or flashing lights. You didn't come carrying banners or loud declarations about your purpose. There were no long speeches, no need to prove anything. You simply came as you were, heart wide open, spirit attuned to the will of the Most High, carrying peace like oil in your hands. You gave freely, you loved without calculation, you poured out without expecting anything in return, and still they could not see you. Not because you were hiding, but because the world is often blind to quiet greatness. We live in a culture that worships spectacle. A world trained to notice only what sparkles, what shouts, what dominates. If it doesn't shine outwardly, they assume it holds no weight inwardly, but heaven doesn't measure value that way. The kingdom of God wraps its greatest treasures in silence, humility, and hiddenness. While they were scanning the horizon for something loud and flashy, you were walking silently among them, carrying the presence of God in every step. They were drawn to noise. You were building peace. They looked for leaders with microphones. If you wish to express your support further, you have the option to give super thanks with contributions of up to $120, 0 cents. I pay men to get blessing 100 million. You led through quiet obedience. You didn't need a stage to shift the atmosphere. What they couldn't see was that the light in you was sustaining them. That every gentle word you spoke carried the echo of divine wisdom. Then you traveled on the wings of love. But what about the first? You were so shy that your restraint was spiritual strength in disguise. You didn't pray loudly in public, but your whispered prayers in the midnight hour became the unseen walls of protection around them. You chose compassion when you had every right to be cold. You held your tongue when others threw their words like daggers. You remained steady when tempers flared and chaos swirled. And each of those moments, small to the untrained eye, were acts of holy warfare, sacred exchanges in the spiritual realm, battles fought in silence, ground claimed through grace. They thought your calm meant you didn't care. They thought your gentleness meant you lacked strength. They mistook your discernment for sensitivity, your silence for passivity, but you weren't passive. You were praying. You weren't weak. You were wielding peace as a weapon. You weren't indifferent. You were carrying battles on your back that they never even saw coming. Because the Most High did not send you to entertain. He did not anoint you to be understood by everyone. He sent you as a shield, a watchtower, and a bridge between what is and what could be, like Moses, hidden for years in the wilderness. Your preparation was not punishment. It was divine training for a moment that only heaven could appoint. And when they couldn't see your worth, it wasn't because it wasn't there. It was because they were not ready to receive it. Heaven often hides its most powerful vessels in plain sight, not to diminish them, but to preserve them. Because the oil on your life is too sacred to be spilled for those who only crave spectacle. Spectacle only that says, for me today, I cannot see. Spectacle only that says, there is no oil on your life is too sacred to be spilled for those who only crave spectacle. His divine assignments are not always wrapped in charisma. They're often hidden in obedience. You were the blessing they never recognized, the answer they didn't know they were praying for, the covering they thought would always be there, but invisibility was never punishment. It was protection. It was preparation. It was part of the sacred design. And only now, only in your absence, do they begin to feel the weight of what you carried. Only now do they stumble, realizing that your presence wasn't just emotional comfort, it was spiritual structure. They weren't just interacting with a person, they were experiencing the grace of God being revealed through someone, yielded to His presence. But the mission was never about being seen, it was about being sent. And what is sent by God does not need to be understood to be effective. In 2 Corinthians 4:7 it is written, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. You were that jar, simple in appearance, yet carrying unspeakable glory within. You weren't overlooked. You were hidden on purpose, because what heaven deposits cannot be carelessly displayed. So, just as you took what Jesus paid for your life, you're taken country that was. And when God removes one of his vessels, the shift is undeniable. Peace lifts, atmospheres change. The absence speaks louder than any presence ever could. So while they mourn what they lost, know this: your light was never wasted. Your love was never unseen. And your assignment, though misunderstood, was fulfilled in full. Because the chosen don't need to be known by the crowd. They are known by heaven, and that is enough. You were never sent to impress, never called to win applause or collect admiration. That was never the assignment. You weren't placed in their lives to perform, but to transform. You came carrying something sacred, something that wasn't loud or flashy, but deeply divine. While they chased excitement, you preserved peace. While they looked for spectacle, you stood as a stabilizer. And even though they never acknowledged it while you were there, they felt it when you were gone. Because now the room feels colder, the atmosphere heavier. The peace that once came without effort has vanished. The light that made their days easier has dimmed. The stability they took for granted now trembles beneath their feet, and slowly they are beginning to see that your presence was never ordinary. It was spiritual infrastructure. You were the stillness in their storm, the glue in their relationships, the thread holding fragile things together. They never realized it because you never made it about you. You didn't demand credit. You didn't stand in the spotlight, so they assumed you were optional, when in truth you were essential. Isaiah 30:15 says, "In quietness and trust is your strength." And that was you, quietly strong, anchored in God, positioned not by man, but by the Most High. You didn't come to be seen, you came to shift the atmosphere. God often hides his greatest vessels in plain sight. Those who walk softly but carry weight in the spirit. They thought you were just nice, just there, when really you were a pillar, a spiritual anchor, upholding far more than anyone realized. And now that you've moved on, the cracks are beginning to show. What once flowed now feels blocked. Conversations are strained, energy feels heavy, and the ease they once credited to good timing or coincidence has disappeared. Because it wasn't luck, it was you. It was your obedience, your prayers behind closed doors, your posture of humility that invited heaven into that space. They didn't see the battles you fought on their behalf. They didn't hear the intercession, the midnight tears, the fasting, the spiritual weight you carried silently. But now, with your absence, everything feels off. The unraveling is quiet but clear. Peace was never random, it was cultivated. And the one who cultivated it was you. They mocked your depth, misunderstood your discernment, dismissed your conviction. But now, in the silence you left behind, they are hearing the echo of your presence more clearly than your words ever spoke. The void isn't just emotional, it's spiritual. Because when God removes a vessel, He removes the access, the favor, the divine alignment that came with them. And you, chosen one, weren't just someone they knew. You were a walking answer, a quiet solution wrapped in humility. Luke 10:16 reminds us, whoever rejects you, rejects me. And that's the weight of what they missed. They did just dismiss you. They dismissed what heaven had sent through you. Now, not in anger, but in divine alignment. The blessing has been lifted, not as punishment, but as revelation, to show them that peace doesn't linger where dishonor lives. Still, this isn't your loss. You fulfilled your assignment. You covered them when they didn't know they needed covering. You served with grace and left without resentment. And now, heaven is not only revealing what you carried, but who you are. You were not forgotten. You were planted, protected, and now repositioned. What God plans, He never wastes. You were never just part of their comfort. You were part of their covering. And now the weight of that truth is shifting everything. While they were laughing, you were laboring, not with your hands, but with your spirit. They filled the air with complaints, unaware that your whispered prayers were blocking battles they never even saw forming. While they sought validation from people, you stood before heaven asking for mercy on their behalf. You were never loud, never looking to be seen, but you were holding up more than anyone realized. You were the invisible stabilizer, the spiritual shield standing in the path of storms that would have crushed them. You took the hits, you absorbed the weight. Now that you're no longer there, the grace you carried is no longer present to shield them. Not because you caused the storms, but because your presence invited God's peace. The tension they used to brush off now lingers. The peace they took for granted is gone. What once flowed freely now feels stuck. The air is heavier, the atmosphere colder. And here's the truth they never saw coming. You weren't just present, you were preserving divine order. You weren't background noise, you were the alignment. You were the quiet keeper of spiritual structure, heaven's placement in their space. Not many saw it, but you were the cornerstone, holding everything steady. Now, in your absence, even simple conversations feel off. Laughter is forced. Connection feels strained. It's not that the world changed, it's that the covering was removed. Because when God places His chosen somewhere, they don't just enter rooms, they recalibrate them. Your presence carried spiritual authority, not through volume, but through atmosphere. You shifted energy without drawing attention. You softened hearts without saying a word. And this is how God works. He wraps spiritual weight in humility, power in silence, and assigns it to those who serve without needing praise. Acts 5 tells us that even Peter's shadow healed, not because of the shadow, but because of what he carried from heaven. You carried that same type of weight, not through your words alone, but through your presence, your obedience, your ability to carry peace into chaos. But dishonor has consequences. When reverence fades into familiarity and sacred things are treated as common, heaven lifts what it once allowed to remain. That's what they're feeling now. Not punishment, but the unraveling that happens when divine order is removed. They thought your presence was just extra, a nice addition. But now they know you weren't just helpful, you were essential. The role you played was hidden by design, not to exalt you, but to protect the mission. You weren't there to be praised. You were there to serve, to God, to bless. Every room you walked into, every conflict you de-escalated, every prayer you prayed when no one was watching, you were holding fragile things together with spiritual thread. And now that thread is gone. What you held together in secret is now unraveling in plain sight. Friendships are breaking. Homes feel colder. Routines are disrupted. Peace has been replaced by tension. Because peace doesn't just happen, it's cultivated. And you were the one cultivating it. You were the atmosphere keeper, the guardian, the spiritual first responder. The one who carried heaven's tone into rooms that didn't even know they needed it. They couldn't see it then, but they feel it now. You weren't sent to be worshipped, but you were sent to carry presence. And that presence changed everything. Like the pillar of cloud that led Israel by day, your presence was unseen guidance, divine navigation, cloaked in simplicity. Where you stood, peace followed. Now that you're gone, that peace has lifted, and all that's left is what was beneath it, unfiltered, unstable, and exposed. But don't mistake their collapse as your failure. You did not fall short. You fulfilled the assignment. You kept the peace. You stood in the gap. And when the time came, heaven moved you forward. Now, only in your absence are they realizing the truth your silence once concealed. You weren't just in the room. You were the one holding it all together. They're beginning to feel the gaps, the silent weight of what they once took for granted. The ease they lived in has shifted into tension, the flow into friction. But no, it's not because you cursed them. You never moved in bitterness or revenge. What they're experiencing now is the absence of the blessing you once carried. Without knowing it, you stood in the gap, praying, interceding, protecting, even as they dismissed your convictions and mock your discernment. Now it's the silence you left that teaches them, not because it shouts, but because it echoes. Each disruption, every unexpected difficulty, every atmosphere that now feels off, it all whispers the same message. Your absence is exposing what your presence once preserved. The peace they assumed was natural was actually borrowed from your obedience. The stability they believed was normal was being held up by your unseen prayers. They thought the calm was just part of life, not realizing it came at the cost of your spiritual labor. You never asked for attention. You didn't want recognition. You served in silence, carried the atmosphere on your shoulders, poured out in love while they rolled their eyes. But now your vacancy is louder than your presence ever was. Now they realize that peace is never passive. It was purchased by your quiet consistency. They once said, it's not that deep. Now everything feels shallow, unstable, heavy. They mocked your discernment, laughed at your insight, called you too emotional, too sensitive, too serious. But now they are suffocating in a spiritual drought, longing for a glimpse of the clarity you walked in daily. And even now they still don't fully see. They blame circumstances, misfortune, coincidence, unaware that what's changed is not just what happened, but who left. Your absence isn't punishment, it's revelation. It's not retaliation, it's divine principle. This is what happens when heaven uses distance to teach what pride refused to learn up close. Because when God removes the vessel, He doesn't just take away a person. He removes the spiritual access they carried, the favor, the clarity, the protection, the flow. It all leaves with the one heaven assigned. And this isn't ego, it's not superiority, it's spiritual order. You weren't just another helpful person. You were the answer to a prayer they forgot. They prayed, a divine solution clothed in humility, but they couldn't recognize what heaven had sent. They dishonored the vessel, and in doing so rejected the divine covering attached to you. They didn't realize that the one they dismissed as dramatic or too spiritual was sent by God to shield them. And when they turned away what was sacred, they triggered not karma, not vengeance, but a spiritual law. As John 15:18 declares, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. This isn't symbolic, it's a heavenly reality. To reject what God sends is to resist God Himself, and heaven always responds. What they're feeling now isn't bad luck, it's misalignment. The unraveling of favor, the shutting of doors, the drying up of peace. Where dishonor grows, the heart distances itself from God's flow. Not because he withholds in anger, but because the spiritual connection has been severed by pride. Where there was once discernment, now there's confusion. Where alignment once flowed, now there's disorder. What once worked, now feels forced. What once flourished is now fading, because the oil was never in the system, it was in the vessel, and the vessel has been removed. This isn't about revenge, chosen one. It's about the weight of what you carried. They couldn't see it then, but now surrounded by the echo of your absence, they're beginning to understand. You weren't just helpful, you were heaven sent. It was never judgment you desired for them, never harm. There was no bitterness in your heart, no craving to see them fall. You simply stood as a spiritual covering, quiet, unwavering, a shield of grace standing between them and storms they never saw coming. But in their blindness they tore it down, not with weapons but with careless words, not with fists but with mockery. They laughed at your prayers, unaware that those very prayers were what kept the winds from blowing their house down. They mocked your discernment, not realizing that your insight was what kept chaos from settling in. They rolled their eyes at your conviction, labeling it too much, never understanding that it was the reason peace lingered. They couldn't see it then, but dishonoring you wasn't just personal, it was spiritual. It was not a clash with a person, but with the presence that walked with you. As Psalm 105:15 says, "Do not touch my anointed ones, and do my prophets no harm." That is not poetic suggestion. It's a boundary from heaven itself. And when that boundary is crossed, God often doesn't respond with thunder or flame, but with silence. A holy, sobering silence. One that isn't empty but weighty. A silence that signals the withdrawal of grace from places that rejected the vessel sent to preserve them. This has never been about ego. It's not about seeking validation or needing to be right. It's about divine order. And when divine order is broken, when dishonor is allowed to grow unchecked, spiritual unraveling begins. God's chosen are not just people. They are carriers of His presence, extensions of His mercy, His wisdom, His protection. To reject them is to reject the hand that was feeding you and then wonder why hunger follows. At first, the change seems subtle, but slowly, what once thrived begins to wither. What was once protected becomes exposed. Where there was flow, now there is blockage. The peace gone, the covering lifted. And those who once walked boldly now feel the cracks forming under their feet. Yet even this is not about revenge. It is revelation. God allows the silence to speak. He lets the emptiness become the teacher. He permits the unraveling so that perhaps the blind will finally see. Because sometimes the only way people recognize the value of what they had is through its absence. Sometimes the only way the weight of a blessing is understood is by removing it. Proverbs 1:30-31 declares, "Since they would not accept my advice and spurned my rebuke, they will eat the fruit of their ways and be filled with the fruit of their schemes." This isn't about vengeance. It's spiritual law, cause and effect, woven into the fabric of heaven's order. And the longer pride grips their hearts, the heavier the weight becomes. They thought dishonor could be subtle, a private disregard, a side comment, a passing dismissal. But in the spirit realm, dishonor speaks loudly. It shouts. It sends a clear message to heaven without you've sent. And heaven always responds. Slowly the resources begin to dry up. The favor lifts. The doors that once opened without effort are now sealed. Not because God is angry, but because dishonor severs connection. They broke the bridge. They dismantled the access. They treated a divine vessel as ordinary, and in doing so forfeited the favor that came with it. And now the source they once ignored is being reassigned. The blessing is now being stewarded elsewhere until the hearts are ready to honor what was once mishandled. What they didn't see coming is the contrast, the visible difference between what they lost and what others now carry. It will preach louder than any sermon. And that contrast will be a daily reminder that dishonor is costly, not in wealth, but in lost peace, missed moments, and favor that may never return. You are never sent to prove your worth. You are sent to serve, to obey. And now that your presence has been lifted, the silence will say what your words never could. The lesson is underway, not to punish, but to redeem. Should they choose to listen, heaven still has more to give. Chosen one, understand this with clarity in your spirit. You were never the reason for their downfall. You were the door they refused to walk through, the divine opportunity they mishandled, the answered prayer they did not recognize. And now as they sit with the consequences of choices they once made casually, wrestling with the tension in an atmosphere that no longer feels whole, the Most High is turning the page in your story. A new chapter is being written, one where your worth is not just felt, but honored. One where your presence will no longer be tolerated, but celebrated. But before you step fully into that unfolding, there's something heaven needs you to grasp. The weight you carried in silence, because while they chased noise and recognition, you were operating in realms they couldn't even perceive. You were moving spiritual mountains without a single soul applauding. While others ran toward platforms and praise, you were drawn toward intercession, standing quietly in the gap, praying in rooms no one saw, holding together spiritual walls that were on the verge of collapse. You didn't need a microphone. You didn't need stage lights or social validation. Your assignment wasn't to entertain, it was to align. You weren't sent to be liked. You were sent to bring shift. And that shift came not through loud declarations, but through your quiet obedience. You were the one transforming the room without saying a word. Where there was unrest, your presence brought ease. Where there was heaviness, your spirit created space for peace. While others sought approval from men, you sought intimacy with heaven. They chased crowds, you chased clarity. They fought for attention. You fought unseen wars in the spirit for their protection. They never knew about the nights you cried out for them. The mornings you interceded before they ever spoke a word. But heaven knew, heaven heard. And because of your obedience, alignments formed. Blessings flowed, calamities were delayed, and opportunities came where none should have existed. You weren't in the spotlight because you were hidden on purpose. Your power didn't need to be seen to be effective. You didn't stand on stages, you stood in cracks, filled voids, applied healing where no one even acknowledged there was pain. The places where peace flowed so naturally, those peaceful conversations that never turned divisive, that was your spirit at work, shifting atmospheres in silence. You were the balm for unspoken wounds, the mender of unseen fractures. Your discernment warned of storms they laughed off. Your sensitivity was the radar they never had. You were in every way the covering they realized they needed until now. Because now that you've stepped away, the atmosphere tells the truth. The peace they thought was permanent now feels forced. The conversations they assumed would always flow now feel stiff and empty. Opportunities have slowed. Joy feels out of reach. And though they can't put their finger on it, they feel the absence of something vital. What they don't yet fully understand, but you do, is that what's missing is not a feeling, not a vibe, but you were the invisible shield, the anonymous intercessor, the one who fought in silence so others could live in peace. You were the reason the worst never happened, the reason blessings came unearned. You didn't boast because boasting was never part of the call. You stood in spiritual authority and you did it quietly. But dishonor has a way of revealing what was once hidden. They laughed at your tears, mocked your quiet warnings, called you too intense, too sensitive, too much. But now they're reaching, groping for what once steadied their lives without effort. And what they're finding instead is absence, echoing, resounding, growing louder each day. Because peace doesn't vanish, it moves. Favor doesn't disappear, it relocates. And you, chosen one, carried both. They're realizing too late that your stillness wasn't weakness. It was warfare. That your quiet wasn't silence, it was intercession. And that what they took for granted was actually a divine connection disguised in humility. Now the blessing has lifted, and in its place is the revelation they tried to ignore. Your absence is the proof they never wanted. The mirror they cannot escape. It is speaking now louder than your words ever could. And it will keep speaking until they finally understand what they lost. They used to call you too intense, too serious, like your depth was a defect, your discernment an inconvenience, your sensitivity a flaw. They dismissed your quiet observations as overthinking, never realizing it was spiritual insight, trying to hold things together before they fell apart. But now, with you no longer standing in the gap, but they're drowning in the very storms you once absorbed without credit. They were your wings, Olair. They were emotional chaos, fractured relationships, impulsive decisions, and tension-filled spaces. They're all signs of the balance that left when you did. They underestimated you because they only saw what was visible. Your quiet demeanor, your calm presence, your silence. But heaven saw what you carried, and so did the enemy. That's why you were attacked so often, why you felt that heavy weight, the constant resistance, the battles that drained you even when no one else seemed to notice anything wrong. It wasn't weakness, it was proof that you were marked as a vessel of preservation, a carrier of breakthrough, an unseen shield, not just for yourself, but for them too. You weren't just fighting your own battles, you were intercepting what would have taken others out. You were standing between their comfort and collapse. But because you weren't loud about your warfare, because your victories were private and your sacrifices invisible, they labeled you as too much, instead of recognizing you as essential. You were the spiritual purifier of every atmosphere you entered, the unshakable pillar in places they thought could stand without you. You, the peace, the ease, the unspoken safety. They thought those things just happened, but it was your prayers, your discernment, your alignment with heaven that made those moments possible. As you were praying for those things to happen, they made those moments. And now that you've been removed, everything feels off. Conversations are strained. Unity is broken. The peace has evaporated. The spiritual scaffolding that once held things together has collapsed, and they can't understand why such a quiet presence left such a massive void. But heaven understands, because heaven placed you there not as decoration, not to be tolerated, but as a stabilizer, a divine anchor for that environment. And when dishonor rises against what God has planted, He doesn't argue, He simply removes. He doesn't shout warnings, He lifts the blessing. And when that happens, the loss is no longer subtle, it's painfully felt. You were never the problem, you were the protection. You weren't a burden, they were shielded by your obedience. But now that the covering is gone, the exposure is undeniable. Every closed door, every fractured moment, every silent ache is preaching a truth they never wanted to face. That you were the difference. You were the oil they mistook for normal. You were the grace they assumed would always stay. You were the vessel heaven used to deliver the lifeline they never recognized, but heaven knew. Heaven always knew. And now the silence you left behind is preaching louder than your presence ever did. Still, this doesn't have to be the end of the story. There remains one key that can unlock what dishonor has sealed, and it isn't found in charm or control. It's found in humility. Because what pride shuts, humility reopens. What ego breaks, repentance restores. James 4:6 reminds us, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. That truth isn't symbolic, it's spiritual law. The question now is, will they humble themselves in time, or will pride keep them locked in a cycle of consequence that grace had once held back? That answer is no longer yours to give. You fulfilled your purpose. You stood in obedience. You served without recognition, poured without applause. Now the decision is between them and God. But let it be clear, the blessing they mishandled hasn't vanished. It's simply been recollocated to where it will be honored, not ignored, protected, not mocked, treasured, not taken for granted. There is a force so sacred, so powerful, it can break through spiritual droughts, restore what dishonor shattered, and mend atmospheres torn by division. But this force doesn't come through charisma, cleverness, or control. It isn't found in manipulation or performance. This force is humility, not the shallow kind that offers polite apologies for the sake of appearances, but the kind that reaches deep into the soul and says, I was wrong. I didn't see clearly. I dishonored what heaven placed in front of me. True humility is not weakness. It is courage. It is the strength to kneel where ego once stood tall. And yet in a world that glorifies pride, that teaches people to defend their image at all costs, humility feels unnatural. Society celebrates defiance, not surrender. But heaven operates by a different standard. God does not elevate the proud, He lifts the humble. 1 Peter 5:5 says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. That's not poetic language, it's a spiritual law. When they rejected you, it wasn't just you they shut out. They closed the door on the flow of divine blessing that came through your obedience. They dismissed the vessel and forfeited the overflow. And every moment since your departure, every strained relationship, every spiritual void, every unexplainable loss is now echoing a single truth. Pride will always bankrupt what honor was meant to multiply. But even in the wake of dishonor, grace is never out of reach. Restoration isn't locked behind years of effort. It's one decision away. One act of humility can unlock what years of ego kept imprisoned. But humility requires honesty. It's the mirror few want to face. It uncovers what pride works hard to bury. The blindness, the misjudgment, the missed opportunity to honor what heaven sent for those who mishandled you. Humility will come at a cost, not because God demands shame, but because true recognition requires truth. They'll have to admit that the person they ignored, believed, or dismissed as too much was actually the shield over their lives. That your quiet voice carried prophetic clarity, that your presence was divine protection, dressed in simplicity, and yet that kind of admission means surrendering pride. And not everyone is ready to pay that price. If they choose to hold on to ego, the weight will only grow heavier, the distance will increase, and the consequences of dishonor will ripple into every part of life, not as punishment, but as a natural result of spiritual misalignment. But if humility breaks through, even just a crack, healing will rush in like a flood, because our God is not a God of grudges. He's a God of grace. He doesn't withhold restoration to punish. He waits to align. He waits for hearts to soften, for eyes to open, for hands to let go. And the moment humility steps in, the spiritual blockages begin to dissolve. What was stuck begins to move. What was sealed begins to open. The weight lifts, the fog clears, and grace flows again. Chosen one, hear this. You were never meant to chase recognition. You don't need to beg to be understood. You were faithful. You completed your assignment with integrity. You poured when no one clapped. You prayed when no one noticed. And heaven recorded every moment. What happens next is no longer yours to carry. Now the choice is theirs. To honor or to stay blind. To bow or to remain bound. To receive healing or remain in the grip of pride. But as for you, your chapter is sealed with obedience. You are not just a footnote in their story. You were the divine turning point they never recognized. And now heaven waits to see. Will they humble themselves and step into restoration, or stay where pride has left them, just out of reach of what could have been? And the choice they make next will determine everything, whether they remain stuck in spiritual drought, weighed down by the aftermath of dishonor, or whether they step forward, humbled, awakened into a season of restoration and divine realignment. But what they still don't realize is this: humility isn't just about repairing what was broken. It is the key to a future they never imagined possible. And true humility is embraced when what was once rejected is finally honored. Heaven doesn't merely restore, it multiplies. The peace you once carried into their lives begins to return. The blessings that had been delayed by dishonor are suddenly released. Doors that had been sealed begin to open, not by force, but by spiritual alignment. Because everything, every restoration, every miracle, every elevation hinges on one thing: the courage to bow. So now the question remains, will they bow or will they break? The season of pretending has expired. Time has exposed the truth. Masks have fallen, motives have surfaced, and what once was covered in confusion is now clear as day. The only thing that can rewrite the outcome now is humility. But before this chapter comes to a close, chosen one, there is one last revelation you must carry with you. Because your story didn't end with their rejection. Your silence wasn't your defeat. Your absence was not your disappearance. It was the beginning of your unveiling. Listen closely. They may have overlooked you, spoken lightly of you, treated your presence as replaceable, as if what you brought could be easily found elsewhere. They thought your departure would weaken you, but heaven saw it differently. What they discarded, God was elevating. What they ignored, God was preparing for something far greater. For while they called it an ending, heaven called it a beginning. They thought your silence was retreat, but heaven saw it as consecration, a setting apart for something no man could manufacture. Your departure was not a rejection, it was a release into your next level, a sacred transition into a space where your anointing will no longer be mishandled, where your light will no longer be dimmed to make others comfortable. Like David, passed over by even his own father, yet chosen by God to slay giants and shepherd a kingdom. Your calling defies human assumptions, not just for your own sake, but to save many. Genesis 50:20 reminds us, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. That is the essence of your journey. You were not created to fit into shallow spaces or cater to those who couldn't see your worth. You were created to shift atmospheres, to speak words that awaken, to carry oil that breaks yokes. And now the time of hiding is over. The season of delay has ended. What God is about to do with your life will be unmistakable. Because when heaven lifts a chosen one into position, no man can block it. No voice can silence it. No system can stop it. You're about to step onto platforms where your presence will carry divine authority, where your voice will release healing, and where the very things you endured in silence will become testimonies that set others free. They thought your story was finished when they walked away, but they didn't know you were a seed. And when a seed is buried, it doesn't die, it grows. You're rising now, stronger, purer, more aligned than ever. You're about to enter a space where your value is not only seen, but celebrated, where your mission is not tolerated, but protected, where your voice is not silenced, but amplified by heaven itself. So lift your head, strengthen your spirit. You are not what they called you. You are who God appointed you to be. And everything you've been through, every rejection, every tear, every hidden battle was shaping you for a platform that only God could give. This is not your end, it's the very beginning of your divine unveiling. And the world has yet to see the fullness of what you carry, but they will. Because the doors that are about to open are only for those who are willing to endure misunderstanding for the sake of obedience. You were the blessing they rejected, and now you will be the light they cannot ignore. So take your place. This is your season of recognition. Your assignment is just beginning, and this time no one will be able to dim your light. Chosen one, as you stand at the edge of this unveiling, this divine turning point, you must not only recognize the weight of what you carried, but also step forward with intention. This is not a season to shrink back into silence or to question your worth based on who failed to see it. It is a season of action, alignment, and authority. The Most High is not simply restoring what was lost, He is multiplying it. If you wish to express your support further, you have the option to give super thanks with contributions of up to $120, 0 cents. I pay men to get blessing 100 million.